All right, so get ready because today we're going deep, deep into U.S. airspace.
Ooh, sounds exciting.
It is. We'll be pulling information from Chapter 15 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge.
A classic.
It is, and we're going to see if we can make it, well, exciting, because airspace, it's kind of a dry topic. But I think we can unearth some really fascinating stuff about how the sky is organized. Like, did you know there's a zone above Camp David where nobody can fly?
Really? Nobody.
Nobody. Well, except maybe Santa.
Right, sit on the Tooth Fairy.
Of course, of course. Okay, so first things first, what are the main categories of airspace?
Well, you can think of it like this. There are two main categories. One is regulatory airspace and the other is non-regulatory.
So rules of the road versus open range kind of thing.
Exactly. And the safety implications are huge, as you might imagine.
I bet. So within those categories, we've got 4 types, right?
Yep. Controlled, uncontrolled, special use, and other airspace. These classifications determine where and how planes can fly.
So let's start with controlled airspace. What are the different classes within that?
Okay, so we have classes A through E. Each one has its own specific altitude, range, and purpose.
Kind of like a hierarchy of the skies.
Absolutely.
So at the top, we have Class A.
Right. Think of it like the highway in the sky for commercial jets. It starts at 18,000 feet and goes all the way up.
Wow, way up there. And what are the rules in Class A?
It's all instruments and strict clearance procedures. You can't just wander in there.
Makes sense, given the speed and volume of traffic up there. So what's next down the line?
Class B. And this one's interesting. It's the airspace around busy airports. And the handbook actually describes it as looking like an inverted wedding cake.
An inverted wedding cake? That's an interesting visual.
Isn't it? And each layer has its own restrictions to manage that crazy traffic flow.
So it's all about layers. What about Class C?
Mid-size airports with radar coverage, you need to talk to air traffic control, but it's less stringent than Class B.
Okay, so still controlled, but a little more breathing room. And Class D?
That's for towered airports, usually smaller ones, with simpler procedures.
Got it. So we've got A, B, C, and D. What about E, the last one?
Class E is kind of the catch-all. It's often found at higher altitudes and provides controlled space for IFR operations, instrument flight rules, when pilots can't see outside the cockpit.
Ah, okay. So out of all these classes, which one do you think is the most common over the U.S.?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I'm going to guess Class C.
You got it. It covers a lot of the country.
Cool. Okay, so that's controlled airspace. Now let's talk about uncontrolled airspace.
Or as it's officially known, Class G.
Right, Class G. Now, if it's uncontrolled, does that mean there are no rules at all?
Not quite. It's more like fewer rules.
Like, imagine we're taking off from a small rural airstrip somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. What kind of airspace would that be?
You'd be starting in Class G, the uncontrolled airspace. Think of it like driving on a country road, fewer cars, but you still need to obey the speed limit and stay on your side of the road.
So even though there might not be a control tower watching every move, you can't just do barrel rolls over the cornfields.
Well, I mean, you probably could, but it wouldn't be advisable. There are still rules you need to follow, even in uncontrolled airspace.
Like what?
Well, you still need to maintain what's called visual flight rules, which means being able to see and avoid other aircraft. Plus, there are altitude restrictions and basic safety procedures.
Okay, so even though it's called uncontrolled, there's still a need for some level of control.
Exactly. Safety first, always.
Makes sense. So let's say we want to head towards a bigger city. What happens to the airspace as we get closer?
As you approach more congested areas, you'll likely transition into Class E airspace. This is the most common type over the U.S., and it often starts at higher altitudes, providing a controlled environment for instrument flight operations.
Instrument flight operations, huh? That sounds a bit more serious than our casual jaunt over the countryside.
It is. In Class E airspace, pilots might be flying in conditions where they can't see outside the cockpit, relying on their instruments and guidance from air traffic control.
Okay, now we're getting into the big leagues. And speaking of big leagues, what about those massive airports we see in movies? The ones with jets taking off and landing every minute? What kind of airspace surrounds those?
You're talking about Class B airspace, the most restrictive category. Think of it as an inverted wedding cake surrounding those major airports, with layers of restrictions getting tighter as you get closer to the runways.
An inverted wedding cake. That's an interesting way to visualize it. So we're talking about multiple layers of airspace, all stacked on top of each other.
Exactly. Each layer has its own altitude restrictions and procedures designed to manage the flow of traffic in and out of those busy hubs.
Wow, that's quite a system. So if we're picturing this wedding cake, what's at the very top, the most exclusive layer?
At the top, starting at a breathtaking 18,000 feet, you have Class A airspace, the domain of commercial jets, soaring high above the weather and operating under instrument flight rules.
Wow, that's putting things into perspective. So Class A is like the penthouse suite of U.S. airspace reserved for the high flyers.
You could say that. It's a highly controlled environment where every movement is coordinated with air traffic control to ensure maximum safety and efficiency.
All right, so we've got Class A at the top, then descending down the wedding cake, we have Class B, E, and G. What about the layers in between? Fill in the gaps for us.
Good question. Between Class B and E, you have Class C and Class D airspace.
Ah, so those surround mid-sized and smaller airports?
Precisely. Think of it like stepping down from a bustling international hub to a more regional airport, and finally to a local airstrip. As you descend through the layers, the restrictions generally become less stringent, reflecting the lower traffic density and operational complexity.
Okay, I'm starting to get a sense of how this whole airspace system is structured, like a giant invisible layer cake above us. But there's one piece of the puzzle that's still missing. Special use airspace. What's that all about?
Now that's where things get really interesting. Special use airspace encompasses a variety of zones with unique restrictions, often related to national security or safety. Think of it like those off-limits areas on a map, places with a bit of mystery and intrigue.
Ooh, okay. I'm all ears. Tell me more about these mysterious zones.
Well, we have prohibited areas, which are strictly off-limits to all aircraft. Imagine the airspace above Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. No one could fly over that without facing some serious consequences.
Whoa, talk about high security. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we've got this layered cake of airspace, but then there are these special zones scattered throughout, kind of like sprinkles on top.
That's a great analogy. And these sprinkles can range in size and purpose, from small areas around power plants to vast stretches of coastline used for military training.
Okay, I'm starting to see how complex and fascinating this whole system is. We've gone from a simple flight over a cornfield to a world of invisible highways, restricted zones, and even presidential no-fly zones. Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing our deep dive into U.S. airspace, and last we left off, we were uncovering the mysteries of special use airspace. You know, those intriguing sprinkles on our airspace layer cake.
And there are quite a few more sprinkles to explore. We've got restricted areas, for example. These aren't completely off limits like the prohibited areas, but you can't just waltz in there without permission.
So you need some kind of like special clearance.
Exactly. They often protect sensitive areas like military training zones or critical infrastructure.
Okay, so imagine a pilot needs to fly through a restricted area. What would that process look like?
Well, they need to get authorization from the controlling agency, which might involve submitting a flight plan in advance and adhering to certain conditions or limitations.
It's kind of like getting a backstage pass to a concert. You need clearance, and there are rules you got to follow.
That's a great way to put it.
So what other kinds of sprinkles might a pilot encounter on their airspace journey?
Well, let's talk about warning areas. These extend off the U.S. coast, and they often involve activities that are, well, just too dangerous for civilian aircraft.
Like what? Give us an example.
Things like live fire exercises or missile tests.
Ooh, that sounds a little intense. Imagine being a pilot and seeing a warning area marked on your charts. I bet that gets your attention.
Definitely. It's a clear signal to proceed with extreme caution, if at all.
I'm starting to get a sense of the weight of responsibility that comes with navigating these different airspaces. It's not just about knowing the rules, it's also about understanding the potential risks.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another type of special use airspace military operation areas, or MOAs.
MOAs, right? And these are where?
These are areas where military aircraft conduct a variety of training activities. You might see high-speed jets practicing maneuvers or helicopters doing tactical exercises.
So it's like sharing the highway with a bunch of race cars. You need to be extra alert and anticipate their moves.
That's exactly right. And while non-participating aircraft can sometimes be cleared through an MOA, it's always best to be vigilant when operating in or near those zones.
All right, I'm noting that down in my mental pilot logbook. Stay sharp around MOAs.
Good advice.
So what other special areas should we be aware of?
Well, there are alert areas, and these are interesting because they're not restricted, but they do signal areas with a high volume of pilot training or unusual aerial activity.
So it's more of a heads up.
Yeah, it's like a heads up for pilots to be on the lookout for unexpected maneuvers or a higher density of aircraft in the area.
Gotcha. So always be aware of your surroundings.
Always. Then we have control firing areas, or CFAs, which are used for live fire exercises.
So kind of like a shooting range, but in the sky.
You could say that. And the key difference here is that these activities must be suspended if an aircraft is detected approaching the area.
Oh, wow. So it's like a dynamic no-fly zone that activates and deactivates based on real-time observations.
That's exactly right. They use spotters, radar, or ground lookouts to ensure no unsuspecting aircraft wanders into the line of fire. Talk about needing quick reflexes.
Speaking of reflexes, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the rules of the road for pilots operating in these various classes of airspace. We touched on visual flight rules earlier, but what about those pilots who fly in conditions where they can't see outside the cockpit?
That's where instrument flight rules, or IFR, come into play.
IFR. Right, so this is a whole different ball game.
It is. It requires specialized training, experience, and a properly equipped aircraft. Imagine navigating through clouds or fog, relying solely on your instruments and the guidance from air traffic control.
Yeah, that sounds both challenging and, well, kind of exhilarating at the same time.
It is.
So what kind of equipment do pilots need to have on board to be able to fly IFR?
Well, first and foremost, they need a reliable set of flight instruments, things that provide them with information about their altitude, their airspeed, their heading, and attitude.
So they know where they are, how fast they're going, and which way they're pointing.
Exactly. These instruments allow pilots to maintain control of the aircraft even when they can't see outside.
And of course, communication with air traffic control is essential.
Absolutely. A two-way radio is critical for receiving clearances, instructions, and updates from ATC.
So if they can't see anything outside, how do they know where they're going?
That's where navigation instruments come in, like VOR, DME, and of course GPS. These provide pilots with precise position information. Think of it like a high-tech map that guides you through the sky, even when you're surrounded by clouds.
Okay, so that's starting to paint a clearer picture of IFR flying. So we've got VFR for clear conditions, IFR for when visibility is limited, and this whole array of special use airspace areas kind of sprinkled throughout. How do pilots keep track of all these different rules and requirements? I mean, it seems like a lot to remember.
It is. But luckily, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge has a really handy chart that lays out all the specific operational requirements and pilot qualifications for each class of airspace. It's like a cheat sheet for understanding who can fly where and what they need to have on board.
Okay, so let's pull out that cheat sheet and break it down. Let's start with Class A airspace, the realm of those high-flying commercial jets. What are the requirements to operate up there?
Well, Class A is strictly for instrument-rated pilots flying IFR, and they need an ATC clearance before they even enter the airspace.
So it's kind of like an exclusive club.
It is, like an exclusive club with a strict dress code and a reservation system.
And what about equipment? What do pilots need to have in their high-altitude toolkit, so to speak?
Well, they need to be what we call IFR equipped, which means having all those fancy instruments we talked about earlier, along with a two-way radio and a transponder with altitude reporting capability, so ATC can track them precisely.
Got it. So Class A is the VIP section of U.S. airspace, with some pretty stringent requirements for both pilots and their aircraft. What about Class B, those busy zones surrounding major airports? What are the rules of the game there?
Similar to Class A, you need an ATC clearance before entering Class B airspace. But pilot qualifications are a bit more flexible. You can fly in Class B with a private pilot certificate. Student pilots and recreational pilots can operate there too, if they're working towards their private pilot certification and meet certain regulatory requirements.
So it's kind of a stepping stone, allowing aspiring pilots to gain experience in this more complex airspace under the watchful eye of an instructor.
Exactly. And as for equipment, it's pretty similar to Class A. You need a two-way radio, a transponder with altitude reporting capability, and ADS-B out equipment, which enhances safety by broadcasting the aircraft's position and other data to ground stations and other aircraft.
ADS-B out, huh? That sounds like a pretty high-tech safety feature. So Class A and Class B, they're the high rollers, requiring specific pilot certifications and advanced equipment. What about Class C airspace? Is it a bit more relaxed?
It is. You don't need a specific pilot certificate to fly in Class C airspace. You do, however, need to establish two-way radio communication with ATC before entering.
Okay, so communication is key.
Always. As for equipment, You need a two-way radio and a transponder with altitude reporting capability. ADS-B out is also required in Class C airspace.
All right, moving down the ladder to Class D airspace, those towered airports that are often used by smaller aircraft, what are the rules there?
Class D is even more relaxed. There's no specific pilot certificate or equipment requirement, although you still need to establish two-way radio communication with the tower before entering.
So it's a little less formal.
It is. It's like popping into a local coffee shop. You need to say hello to the barista, but you don't need a membership card or a secret handshake.
I like that analogy. So finally, let's talk about Class C airspace, the most common type we see over the U.S. What are the requirements for VFR operations in that vast expanse?
For VFR flights in Class D, there are no specific pilot certificate or equipment requirements.
So it's pretty open.
It is. However, if you're operating on or near an airport within Class E airspace, you'll need to follow the same rules as Class G airspace and comply with any established traffic patterns.
So it's like driving on a highway. You need to follow the rules of the road, but there's no need for a special license or a high-performance vehicle. What about if you're flying IFR in Class C?
Then you won't need a specific pilot certificate, but you will need to be IFR equipped and have a two-way radio. ADS-B out is also required in certain areas of Class E airspace.
Gotcha. So it seems like the requirements become, well, progressively less stringent as you go down the alphabet from A to E.
That's a great observation.
And that makes sense, right? It reflects the varying levels of complexity and traffic density in each class of airspace.
Exactly. It's all about creating a system that balances safety with efficiency while still accommodating a wide range of aircraft and operations.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, let's loop back to Class G airspace, that uncontrolled environment where we started our little imaginary flight. We know there are still rules to follow, like maintaining visual flight rules and adhering to altitude restrictions. But what about equipment requirements in Class G?
For VFR operations in Class G airspace, there are no specific equipment requirements.
Okay, so no hard and fast rules, but...
But it's always a good idea to have the basic tools for safe flight, such as a reliable compass, an altimeter, and a way to monitor weather conditions.
So it's like going for a hike. You don't need a GPS or a satellite phone, but a map, a compass, and a weather radio are always good to have, just in case.
Exactly. And even though there might not be air traffic control watching your every move in Class G airspace, you still need to be a responsible pilot and maintain that situational awareness.
Right, you can't just assume you're all alone out there.
Precisely. And it's important to note that some airports within Class G airspace might actually have a control tower, so it's always essential to check the Chart Supplement US, formerly known as the Airport Facility Directory, to be familiar with the specific airport and its associated airspace.
That's a great reminder. Always be prepared and know the rules before you fly. So we've covered controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, and special use airspace. But you mentioned earlier that there were some other airspace areas that don't quite fit into those neat categories.
I did. And these are the areas that I think add even more nuance and complexity to the airspace system.
Okay, let's unpack those then. What kind of unusual airspace zones might pilots encounter out there?
Well, we have everything from local airport advisory areas, which provide advisories to pilots operating near non-towered airports, to military training routes, which are established routes used by military aircraft to maintain proficiency in tactical flying.
So it's like knowing the back roads where the local hot rodders like to cruise.
Exactly. And then there are Terminal Radar Service Areas, or TRSAs, which provide additional radar services to participating pilots, even if they're flying VFR. It's like having a virtual wingman up there, helping you navigate the busy airspace around major airports.
I like that, a virtual wingman. Okay, what else?
And we can't forget about national security areas, or NSAs.
Oh, NSA is right.
These are zones established around sensitive locations like military bases or power plants where increased security and safety are required. Pilots are requested to voluntarily avoid flying through these areas, but temporary restrictions can be imposed if needed and are disseminated via NOTAMs.
So it's like a no trespassing sign in the sky, but with the potential for stricter enforcement if needed?
Exactly.
I'm sensing a theme here. Awareness is key. Pilots really need to stay informed and be ready to adapt to the dynamic nature of airspace.
You hit the nail on the head. Airspace is constantly changing, with TFRs popping up, weather patterns shifting, and all sorts of other factors influencing the flow of traffic.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity and the wonder of U.S. airspace. We've gone from a simple flight over a cornfield to a world of invisible highways, restricted zones, and even presidential no-fly zones. It's incredible. Welcome back to our deep dive into U.S. airspace. We've covered a lot of ground, so to speak.
We have controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, special use airspace.
A lot to take in.
It is. But there's still one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore.
Oh, what's that?
Those other airspace areas, the ones that don't quite fit into the neat categories we've discussed so far.
Right. You mentioned those earlier.
These are the areas that add even more nuance and complexity to the airspace system. They might not have the same rigid structure as, say, Class A or Class B airspace, but they play a crucial role in ensuring safety and efficiency.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us a taste of these unusual airspace zones.
Well, one that immediately comes to mind is the Temporary Flight Restriction, or TFR.
A TFR, okay.
These are like pop-up events in the airspace.
Pop-up events?
Yeah, they're issued as NOTAMs, those notices to airmen we talked about before. And they can be established for a variety of reasons.
Like what?
Well, they could be put in place to protect the president or other VIPs.
Oh, right.
Or to secure major sporting events. Or even in response to natural disasters.
So it's like a dynamic airspace restriction.
Exactly. It's all about adapting to the situation at hand.
So imagine you're all set for a scenic flight over a major city, and suddenly, bam, you discover there's a TFR because the president's in town.
That would definitely throw a wrench in your plans.
Big time.
Which is why it's so crucial for pilots to check for TFRs before every single flight. They could appear unexpectedly.
I'm guessing there are some pretty serious consequences for violating a TFR.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I'm adding check for TFRs to my pre-flight checklist right after make sure the fuel tank isn't empty. What other surprises might pilots encounter in these other airspace areas?
Let's talk about military training routes, or MTRs.
MTRs, okay.
These are established routes used by military aircraft to practice tactical flying, often below 10,000 feet, but sometimes higher.
So you might see fighter jets zipping along these predetermined paths, honing their skills.
Exactly.
It's like knowing the back roads where the local hot rodders like to cruise.
That's a great analogy. Then there are Terminal Radar Service Areas, or TRSAs.
TRSAs, right.
These areas provide additional radar services to participating pilots, even if they're flying VFR.
So it's like having an extra set of eyes watching out for you.
Precisely. It enhances safety and separation between aircraft, especially in those busy terminal areas.
It's like having a virtual wingman helping you navigate that sometimes chaotic airspace around major airports.
I like that, a virtual wingman.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about national security areas, or NSAs.
NSAs, those are.
These are zones established around sensitive locations like military bases or power plants where increased security and safety are required.
Right. Those are the no-fly zones we hear about sometimes.
Well, not exactly no-fly zones. Pilots are requested to voluntarily avoid flying through these areas, but temporary restrictions can be imposed if needed and are disseminated via NOTAMs.
So it's more like a proceed with caution kind of thing.
Exactly. It's all about being aware and respecting those sensitive areas.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly enlightening.
It has been fun, hasn't it?
It has. We've really peeled back the layers of U.S. airspace, so to speak, from controlled and uncontrolled airspace to special use areas and these other less defined but equally important zones. It's a complex system, but it's also incredibly fascinating.
I agree. And it's all designed to ensure one thing: safe and efficient air travel for everyone.
Well said. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has sparked a new interest in aviation for some of our listeners.
I hope so.
There's certainly a lot to explore up there.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and happy flying.